Now listen to what Paul said in the book of Corinthians, in the opening chapter of the first book of Corinthians. He said, consider your calling. Now let me paraphrase that. This is the Gill translation for this morning at Longboat Island Chapel. Consider your calling. No, consider your kitchen. Consider your kitchen, not somebody else's kitchen. What you're called to do, what you're called to be, how you're called to serve, how you're called to create in this life. And somebody once said that our calling lies at the intersection of the world's great need and our glad desire. And where those two things intersect, we find our calling. If you're going to be the President of the United States, be the President because that's what you're called to be, not because that's what your father wants you to be. If you're called to be a minister because God is calling you to be a minister, not because your priest told you that you should be a minister. If you're called to be an artist because there's nothing you can do but paint. If you're called to be a nurse, become a nurse because that's what you really feel compelled to do, not so you can find a good doctor to marry. That's happened. If you're called to be a caregiver for a dying parent, do it because that's what you feel called to do, not because your siblings have told you that it's your responsibility to do it. If you're called to serve on the church board, if you're called to serve church, your family dinner every night, do it because God has placed that in your heart, and that's your passion, and that's your service, and that's your creative outlet. And when you find it, don't be diverted or distracted from fulfilling it. It may cost you something to follow your calling, your creative outlet, your passion in life. Now go back to Arnie in Vesuvio. In order to get back into the kitchen, he had to give up some things he really liked doing. He loved schmoozing with the customers. And he loved telling corny jokes. And he loved running the business. But ultimately, he wasn't happy doing that. And ultimately, his business was suffering. So he had to get back into the kitchen. A couple of more restaurateurs I want to tell you about. The first is fictional. His name was Rocky Balboa. And you can tell I like boxing movies. Well, you see, Rocky retires from boxing in the last movie, and he opens an Italian restaurant. He can't cook a lick, but he hires a Mexican chef who really knows how to cook Italian food. He's a great cook. And Rocky spends all of his time out in the lobby fraternizing with the customers and telling boxing stories. He loves doing it, and his customers love hearing him do it. And his business thrives, and he's a happy guy. You see, for Rocky, his kitchen wasn't a literal kitchen. It was someplace else. The other chef I want to tell you about is my friend Ray Artke, who's the chef and owner of Euphemia Hay. And if you know Ray, you know he's a great chef. If you haven't tasted his duck, then you haven't lived. So he loves cooking, he loves being in that kitchen, and he loves people too. He's great with people as well. But a couple of years ago, he decided to enlarge his kitchen. And I'm talking about this in a symbolic way. To expand his repertoire, he decided he was going to write a book. And he did write the book. It's called The Crazy Chef. It's his story about growing up in an insane asylum. His parents owned it and ran it. And he grew up in it. The Crazy Chef. Anyway, in order to enlarge his kitchen, Ray had to give up something. He sold his 1960 Corvette in order to publish the book. Because he really wanted to do this. It may cost you something to follow your heart, to follow your dream, to get into your kitchen. And I remember, on a personal note, a few things I had to give up when I started discovering where my kitchen was, my ministry, my calling to ministry. And I was about ready to complete my college education in Sacramento State University. I was going to enroll in law school right there in Sacramento. And I was in love with this beautiful girl. I ended up marrying her. Not this girl. Another life, but anyway. I was on a pretty good track. And I got this calling, you know. I guess it came from God. I hope it did. I think it did. And, you know, it involved moving from Sacramento to Portland, Oregon to study religion. So, kind of in a heartbeat, I withdrew from my classes and decided this is what I needed to do, was to go study religion and theology. And that meant two things, two losses. One was this girl I wanted to be around, and that was a big deal. And the other was my car, because I've always been this car guy. You know this by now. And I had, you know, I worked and saved my money all through high school and into college, and I had, you know, a 1975 Plymouth Duster 344 speed, 6-pack, racing stripes. It was just this beautiful car, you know. And in order to get up to Oregon, I always paid my own way through college. I always worked, you know, part-time. But in order to get up there, I had to sell this car because I needed cash, because this was going to be an expensive venture for me. You know, I used to be able to go to State College in Sacramento in California for almost nothing. But now I was going to a private college and I needed some resources. So I had to sell this car, and so I did. I sold the car and I bought a 1967 Dodge Dart. And I loaded it up, and I drove up to Oregon, and it was a big deal. Now today, for me, 500 miles is nothing, but back then, in 1976 or whatever it was, 500 miles was an eternity. You know, that was a long way. You didn't drive home on weekends. You didn't fly, certainly didn't fly anywhere, didn't have that kind of money, and you didn't even call much, because in those days, you didn't have cell phones, and you had to call long distance. Remember that? When you used to say, is that a long distance call? So once a week, I would have a phone call to my girlfriend. And those were some things I had to, those are sacrifices for me. But you know, I never regretted a day of it. The joy I found when I found my kitchen. I remember my first systematic theology class, and we picked up Reinhold Niebuhr's Nature and Destiny of Man, and that just took me to another level in my spiritual life. And I never regretted it. So finding your kitchen may cost you something, but I'm telling you, it's where the joy is, especially if it involves your service.